In 2013, Wellington Airport was renamed Middle of Middle-earth. 3 huge sculptures were suspended from the terminal ceiling, a giant golem trying to catch a fish, and 2 eagles. This was done in promotion for Peter Jackson's new blockbuster adaptation of Tolkien's The Hobbit.
It's official. New Zealand is still Middle-earth.
I know I'm a Kiwi, but I have to say I cannot imagine making these films anywhere but this country.
2, 1, let's go!
So why all the excitement? This all starts back in 1999, when Peter Jackson helmed the Lord of the Rings trilogy, 3 blockbusters shot back-to-back in New Zealand. The films were made on a comparatively small budget and with largely local crews. They went on to gross billions and became box office and award sensations. 10 years later, love the films was as strong as ever, and when it was announced that Jackson would be directing a 3-part adaptation of The Hobbit in New Zealand, Middle-earth mania swept the country. Airports and tourist hotspots added sculptures, signs, and Hobbit paraphernalia. Some of this was just movie marketing capitalising on nostalgia for the Lord of the Rings, but a number of changes were permanent, like the Hobbiton movie set near Matamata, which was rebuilt as a tourist destination. Wellington Airport regained its name, but the sculptures remained in situ, except for Gollum. Apparently he was scaring children. One of the eagles did briefly fall down in an earthquake, and luckily no one was hurt, because what a way to go. New Zealanders took the identification with hobbits to heart. It wasn't just that Jackson's 2 trilogies were good for the economy, but they gave the country a platform on the global stage, something to be known for beyond having a lot of sheep. In a country of just over 5 million, practically everyone had some tie to the films. Plenty of other huge film franchises have been made here, like the recent Avatar films. But none have even come close to catching the imagination of the country as powerfully as Lord of the Rings. Certainly not enough to have sculptures hanging in the airport for 10 years. The book trilogy, of course, has nothing particularly to do with New Zealand. J.R.R. Tolkien was an academic and an expert in languages, and was one of the first scholars with a contemporary sense of the various historical and mythical strands of English cultural identity. The weight of intertwined language, fairy tale, and saga gives The Lord of the Rings the heft of a mythic history, albeit a distinctly English history. But that's a lot to get into off the bat. This story starts with a very different film, made during the years when Peter Jackson and his partner Fran Walsh were despairing of ever getting rings made. The year is 1995. The place is Pukeroa Bay.
Behind me is the house of an elderly lady called Hannah Mackenzie. About a year ago, I had a call from my mother. She said I should drop in on Auntie Hannah sometime because she was wondering if I'd be interested in a lot of old films that she had stored in a shed at the bottom of her garden.
In the mid-90s, Peter Jackson and fellow filmmaker Costa teamed up to make a documentary for TV, Forgotten Silver. The film opens with Jackson discovering a trove of old film reels in his neighbour's garden shed, which were made by a forgotten New Zealand filmmaker, Colin Mackenzie.
A treasure trove of films that are of major historic importance, not just for New Zealand, but worldwide.
Here was this unknown genius who died in obscurity and who now belongs, in the pantheon of great cinema artists and innovators.
Colin Mackenzie was a forgotten pioneer of New Zealand filmmaking. He was an inventor too, making the first colour film, the first talkie, and the first feature film. He had a knack for being in the right place at the right time, even filming Richard Pearce's first flight, proving that a New Zealander had flown a plane before the Wright brothers. The culmination of his career was directing a massive biblical epic in the middle of impenetrable bushland. The catch is that none of this is real. Jackson and Botes use actors and old film cameras to fake early footage and photos, and wove in interviews with real talking heads of the film industry. In the opening scene, Peter Jackson literally leads the camera up the garden path. The joke was meant to become increasingly clear as Mackenzie's story got more and more ridiculous.
Aged only 12, Colin built his first motion picture camera. When Colin rode the bicycle, his camera rolled, thus creating the cinema's first tracking shots.
Well, we carefully crafted a crescendo of bullshit. This guy in the backwoods beating flax to get cellulose. I mean, it was completely ridiculous. So yeah, we thought about this point people would twig.
But when audiences sat down to watch Forgotten Silver on the 29th of October 1995, people were completely taken in. At the time, mockumentaries were still a bit of a novelty, and the film was playing in a Sunday theatre slot alongside real docos. Costa recalled receiving phone calls from impressed producers who couldn't believe the story Jackson's team had uncovered. Descendants of aviator Richard Pearce rang to thank film production for proving that their ancestor was the first man to fly. Film lecturers scrambled to assure their students they'd be covering Mackenzie on the syllabus. The excitement got so out of hand that TVNZ had to run a story interviewing Jackson, who revealed the hoax. Jackson and Botus received torrents of furious letters, even death threats, as the country realised they'd been taken in. It's always interested me that so many people were willing to believe the story was real. And sure, the filmmakers definitely worked to make it seem legitimate. A fake article even ran in The Listener before the mockumentary aired, drumming up excitement about the amazing finds Jackson had made in a garden shed. But I think it goes deeper than that. People wanted to believe that New Zealand was the kind of country where a man like Colin Mackenzie could have invented every single filmmaking technique and then vanished into obscurity. New Zealand has always been a locus of invention. This is partly out of necessity. It's an isolated country which for many years was a closed market with high taxation on imports. In 1900 it recorded the world's highest number of patent applications per capita. This tendency to make things out of whatever was handy was dubbed the number 8 wire mentality, named for a type of versatile fencing wire. Forgotten Silver affectionately spoofs on this can-do self-image.
Colin's later attempt to mechanize a home-built projector leapt way beyond pedal power.
I don't know who else would have thought of using steam power to drive a projection system, but he did, and it worked.
Jackson and his collaborators had a keen eye for what sort of a hero New Zealanders celebrated. If there's any real-world equivalent to Mackenzie, a maverick filmmaker driven to scale and spectacle, a big fish in a small pond, it's Peter Jackson. Like Mackenzie, Jackson was obsessed with cutting-edge technology, with doing things in film that hadn't been done before.
We're in a small building and we've got all this gear that we bought it and didn't have a clue really how it worked. We're kind of doing it, they can do it so we can do it. It's a real Kiwi attitude, I think, which is kind of fun.
The film would become a 4-hour epic with a cast of thousands. Men, women and children were recruited from all around the district. After days travelling through tough and inhospitable terrain, Colin Mackenzie's extras were confronted by an incredible sight.
He retreated into the most remote part of the country and he built a huge city. This was the biggest man-made structure ever to be built in this country.
Mackenzie's lost set, which Jackson is searching for in this scene, is, like everything else in the film, fake. It's largely filmed at the National War Memorial in central Wellington. The real spectacular film sets, the ones which tourists would shell out money to visit years after the film's production, would be those built by Jackson and his collaborators in only a few years' time.
With financial support from the New Zealand Film Commission, the painstaking restoration proceeded smoothly. A gala premiere was planned for New Zealand's most extraordinary feature film.
Forgotten Silver ends with an enthusiastic, fake audience trooping into Wellington's Embassy Cinema to watch a screening of Colin Mackenzie's restored biblical epic. 8 years later, the same cinema was restored, and a very real audience of 100,000 people lined the streets of Wellington to celebrate the Embassy's premiere of Return of the King. The scale of the premiere was completely unprecedented for a city which at the time had a population of around 180,000. A red carpet ran all the way down Courtney Place, and a jumbo jet painted with scenes from the movie flew over Wellington Harbour. Even I was there. I was one, so I don't really remember it, but technically I was somewhere in that crowd. The following year, Return of the King went on to win 11 Oscars at the Academy Awards.
To the people of New Zealand and the government of New Zealand and the city councils and everybody who's supported us.
Over the 5 years of the trilogy's filming and release, New Zealand came to love and identify with Middle-earth. But this sense of protectiveness over Lord of the Rings would cause problems down the track. After the immense success of Lord of the Rings, all eyes were on the other popular unadapted Tolkien property. Jackson had wanted a Hobbit film to be the first part of his Rings trilogy, but the Tolkien estate had sold the rights to MGM. After much wrangling, several lawsuits, MGM nearly going bankrupt, and the original director's departure after 18 months' expensive pre-production in New Zealand, Jackson ends up once again helming a Middle-earth trilogy, Still set to be shot here circa 2010. Okay, we're getting into complicated territory here, and for the full story I of course recommend Lindsay Ellis's coverage. The short version goes like this. Actors in New Zealand don't work on union contracts, so they earn less than their peers overseas. The performers' union, Equity New Zealand, decides to try and bring the New Zealand situation level with international standards. With the International Federation of Actors on board, they have the world's major actors' unions on side to boycott the movies. Warner Bros. Are not happy about this. They play their Uno reverse card, announcing they'll be seeking overseas filming locations. Jackson makes a furious TV appearance claiming that greedy union actors are jeopardising the films. Nonetheless, Helen Kelly, president of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, manages to oversee an agreement with Warner's, one which makes everyone happy. Jackson, Warner Bros., the unions, and the actors. By the 18th, the actors' boycott is called off, thanks to Kelly. But there's one catch. Warner's has the right to announce the deal. And they simply don't. Not that day, or the next, or the next. Meanwhile, New Zealanders organised protest rallies on the 20th and 25th as part of a wave of backlash, not against Warner, but against the actors. With still no public deal, Warner flies over a pack of executives and lobbyists for talks with the government, involving the Prime Minister himself. Emails released later show that the government also knew that a deal had been reached with the Actors' Union, though ministers publicly denied knowing this. After just 2 days' talks, Warner miraculously agrees on the 27th to make the films here. In return, the government introduces the Hobbit Law on the 28th under urgency, which redefined all New Zealand film workers as freelance contractors unless your contract explicitly stated otherwise. On the 29th, 11 days after the still unannounced union deal was struck, the law is changed so that no matter how many hours you work, no matter how long you've been with a company, you get no sick leave, no holiday pay, and no collective bargaining. The union deal is meaningless. By the time the second Hobbit film came out, the whole story had leaked to New Zealanders. Of course, the complicated legal manoeuvring was not as dramatic as the much simpler message of they're taking the Hobbits to Australia. So despite uproar over the Hobbit Law, we were thrilled when, a little under 10 years later, we learned that another Tolkien saga would be made here. Okay, it's now 2019. Amazon is in the early stages of developing a flagship TV series, The Rings of Power. After many closed-door meetings and expensive bottles of wine, a deal is struck to shoot The Rings of Power in New Zealand. In return, our screen production grant will dollop an extra 5% on top of our standard 20% rebate. This means that for every $4 spent here, the government will pay Amazon $1. Now, lots of countries offer film productions very cushy rebates. In fact, it's often a race to the bottom in terms of who can make their film industry the most lucrative to international productions. But the extremely generous deal to Amazon, of all companies, did raise some eyebrows.
They're the biggest, richest company in the world. Why are we giving them over $100 million?
They're spending over $650 million here, Corinne. I mean, I think this is fantastic. 19% or 350,000 people who came to this country said they did because of what they saw on Lord of the Rings.
Many details of the show's storylines and characters were under wraps, and so production and filming were carried out in absolute secrecy. The sets were closed and even referred to with code names. At the time, the country's borders were closed due to COVID, and there was a lot of curiosity about what was being filmed. But, at least in my memory, the only information that ever trickled out were 1 or 2 casting calls. This was a real contrast to The Lord of the Rings, which was largely filmed on location, and called in so many crew members and extras that an estimated 1 in every 160 New Zealanders were involved in some way. The movies had generated local buzz from the first day of filming. My mum was out walking the dog in the Mount Victoria town belt and found herself watching them shoot the scene where the hobbits hide from a ring wraith. The path is still a popular tourist destination, but the secrecy of Rings of Power meant that there was very little publicity for this extremely expensive production intended to boost tourism. Still, at least it maintained New Zealand's international association with Middle-earth. Until, on the 13th of August 2021, more than a year before the show even premiered, Amazon announced that they were relocating all further production to the UK. In their deal with the government, they'd agreed to give 12 months' notice to the Film Commission if the production were to move. But Amazon is worth 5 and a bit times New Zealand's national GDP, and so in reality they informed ministers the night before the press release. To add insult to injury, several whistleblowers came out and reported on what they saw as the devastating environmental impact of the show. The majority of the show was filmed on sets, which had to be deconstructed, most of which ended up in landfills. Whistleblowers estimated production had generated roughly 14,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So, Lord of the Rings has had a mixed legacy for New Zealand. On the one hand, the films have, of course, done amazing things for increasing the size of the film and tourism industry. I've spoken to a number of people who work in the film industry who either moved here to work on The Hobbit or found their way into the industry through paths created by Rings projects. The so-called Hobbit Law just formalised the common industry practice of contractual work. But the details of the case, the fact that ministers knowingly lied to the public, and that the government bowed to the whims of a film company when a better alternative was on the table, raises the question of whether there are any checks and balances in place to protect those who work on international blockbusters. It's difficult sustaining a film industry in a country as geographically isolated as New Zealand. In order to make it attractive to overseas productions, not only rebates but cheap labour has to be on the table. Big multinational productions eat into the bulk of government rebates, and the benefits are hard to measure. The Minecraft movie was recently made in New Zealand. Is this good for tourism? I wouldn't think so. If anything, our landscapes are losing their uniqueness as they're slowly absorbed into the iconography of multinational franchises. Lord of the Rings' legacy on New Zealand is the creation of an international-facing film industry, which, depending on who you talk to, is either a blessing or a curse. When stepping back, the thing I keep returning to is this never-ending nostalgia for Rings, this continuing sense of the story as a part of our national identity, cost what it may. Even today, there's still plenty of excitement for new Rings projects, and as I alluded to earlier, much more fondness for Rings than the even more profitable New Zealand-made Avatar films. But it's not just the familiar locations which make Lord of the Rings such a compelling national touchstone. There's something in the story itself which has allowed it to seep into the country's collective unconscious. Not so long ago, the bards of Europe were trying to sing their people into being. The Europe of the 1700s wasn't the map we know today. It was a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, local lords and city officials. The average German speaker, for example, would identify as being from their city, not from any unified German nation. Exceptions existed. Britain, in particular, as an island nation, had a well-defined identity. But the world was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution had unleashed the train and the factory, new ways of connecting the material world. The French Revolution set off a tide of democratic upheaval, new ways of uniting the populace. And in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, it was clear that these new empires would gobble you up if you couldn't stake out your own sense of national identity. To compete in this age of revolutions, capital, and empire, social groups needed a way to create these identities on a larger scale. The most popular method of weaving a nation was modelled on the ancient Greeks and Romans, this piecing together of existing mythology into a coherent whole, telling the story of how a people came to be. Patriotic writers started collecting folk tales and returning to the oldest manuscripts in their country's languages, trying to work out stories that could hold their people together against the flattening forces of the new European empires. One of the most famous examples is the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, assembled by Elias Lönnrot. Lönnrot didn't find a manuscript sitting in a dusty library somewhere. He was a physician with a passion for local songs and folk tales. While working as a district doctor in eastern Finland, Lönnrot began collecting some of these folk tales from local peasants. He strung them together into a single long epic poem, which was published in 1835, telling the story of the creation of the world all the way through to the arrival of Christianity in Finland. The Kalevala has since become a major part of Finnish identity. In fact, by writing it, Lönnrot arguably ensured that the Grand Duchy of Finland held on to its cultural identity, despite being under the Russian Empire. In a sense, the attempt to form these national identities could be considered the first modern wave of anti-colonial resistance against the European great powers. even if some of these nations, having told their story successfully, went on to have their own colonial empires. Lönnrot made no attempt to claim that his synthetic epic was an authentic document from a lost past. He was open about the hand he had in piecing together the stories and songs. This was a lucky thing. There had been a poet before him who'd been utterly discredited for doing essentially the same thing Lönnrot did. His name was James Macpherson. Born in 1736, Macpherson, who was a Scottish Highlander by birth, saw his people conquered and his culture suppressed by the British Crown during the Highland clearances. At the University of Aberdeen, he studied classics and learned how Homer had united disparate Greek tribes into one people through epic poetry. Like Lönnrot, Macpherson began gathering and translating local folktales and Scottish Gaelic, publishing the first of his translations in 1760. He claimed that these poems were the authentic writings of a primeval bard, a Celtic Homer, Ossian. This was before the rediscovery of Beowulf, and so at the time the British Isles had no national epic. Macpherson was one of the early writers to catch the wave of rising nationalism by turning these folk songs into a celebration of national identity. But, equally, the Ossian poems can also be seen as a kind of multiculturalism, a union of Celtic, English and classical literature into a unified whole. Macpherson's work went on to have an immense influence. Napoleon, Voltaire and even Thomas Jefferson were all admirers of Macpherson. The poems were key influences on everything from Gothic literature to the historical novels of Walter Scott to Romantic poetry. William Hazlitt, the early Romantics' canonical literary critic, listed Ossian alongside Homer, Dante and the Bible as comprising the world's greatest poetry, and Napoleon commissioned paintings in which Ossian welcomed the fallen French soldiers into the afterlife. And beyond their content, the supposed translation of Ossian's Gaelic verse into poetic English prose is one of the earliest instances of English poetry moving from strict metre to a kind of free verse. Even Channel favourite Oscar Wilde has a connection to Macpherson. Wilde's mother, Lady Jane Wilde, was a part of the Irish literary revival, collecting Celtic fairy tales and writing activist poetry under the pseudonym Speranza of the Nation, which is yet another example of the 19th century use of literature and myth to build a national identity. Wilde's middle name was taken from one of the heroes of Macpherson's poems. Writing to friends after his birth, Lady Jane said, "He is to be called Oscar Fingal Wilde. Is not that grand, misty and oceanic?" Put a pin in Wilde, we're coming back to him. But as highly esteemed and important as Macpherson's Ossian poems were, Macpherson had made one crucial blunder. He'd claimed that his work was an authentic translation of Gaelic originals, that he had no hand in shaping it. Macpherson had done no more than Lönnrot in piecing together a culturally unifying pseudo-Homeric narrative out of real oral history, folklore and mythology. But where Lönnrot is taught today to Finnish schoolchildren, Ossian is better remembered as a hoax than as a significant part of British literary history. It would be almost 2 centuries before Britain would see another major attempt at their own mythology. The Lord of the Rings didn't start as a novel, or even as a story, but as a collection of invented languages. Tolkien said his writings were fundamentally linguistic in inspiration. The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. I have discussed this in a previous video, but just to go over the same ground for a little bit, J.R.R. Tolkien was a philologist by training. Philologists study the historical connections between interconnected languages as they evolve and diverge. It's the study of a language family as if it were a river network or a rhizome. Using his philological expertise, Tolkien interwove contemporary English with Old English, Finnish and Welsh to create a family of constructed languages. The story of Middle-earth started as an exercise to write poetry in these languages. But in coming up with his story, Tolkien did exactly what he did in inventing languages. He wove the mythology and history of Northern Europe into a new pattern. In a letter from 1951, Tolkien described his ambition to create a body of more or less connected legends, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story. In the same letter, Tolkien expressed regret that the English had no epic comparable to the Greeks' Homer, the Scandinavian Eddas, the Finns' freshly minted Kalevala, or the various Celtic cultures' epics like Tyne and the Mabinogion. So he took it upon himself to write that epic, the lost mythological history of the English people, ending with the semi-mythological Hengist and Horsa leading the Jutes, Angles and Saxons to 5th century Britain. This is what the famous phrase, "a mythology for England," refers to. The phrase was never said by Tolkien himself, but was biographer Humphrey Carpenter's summary of his intention. Inevitably, this has become the source of thousands of pages of Reddit threads debating Tolkien's precise intention. He may have been self-deprecating when he said he wanted to restore to the English an epic tradition and present them with a mythology of their own. But, of course he would have been crazy if he literally thought that he could replace England's millennia-old imagination full of Arthur and Shakespeare and the empire on which the sun never sets with the philological world-building of a mid-20th century scholar. Nevertheless, Tolkien's weaving of local mythologies and fairy tales into a mythical prehistory is so in line with the 19th century creation of cultural epics that, on a purely literary level, it is a perfectly fine description of his method. More interesting than arguing over the seriousness of Tolkien's mythology is arguing over its being for England. When Tolkien set out to write his prehistory, he was part of the first generation of scholars working from a relatively complete set of historical sources. When Macpherson wrote his Ossian tales, Beowulf was still an obscure manuscript that had not even been copied out for safekeeping. 60 years later, Lönnrot and the brothers Grimm had to go out and collect oral folk tales themselves. By contrast, when Tolkien set out to weave a new story from existing history and myth, he and his contemporaries were the beneficiaries of about 150 years' hard work restoring, archiving and writing scholarship on European manuscripts. So, just as he could learn in detail about existing languages and interlace them into invented ones, Tolkien could study almost everything that hadn't been lost to fire or flood. And it was an amazing variety of texts. Tolkien drew on all the peoples that had formed or touched England in some way. As well as being foundationally inspired by Lönnrot's Finnish Kalevala, he took names of monsters from Old English writings like Beowulf and Middle English ones like the Green Knight. He drew from the myths of various Celtic cultures, especially the Welsh Mabinogion, but also the medieval world's interpretation of the Celtic legends of King Arthur, and his wizard Gandalf, Merlin. He felt the sense of looming apocalypse in the Norse Eddas and Volsung saga, the heroism of European warrior history in the German Nibelungenlied. There are even classical influences like Plato's Republic, from which he borrowed the myth of a magical ring that can turn you invisible, and from Timaeus and Critias, the myth of a lost golden age of half-human, half-divine beings in Atlantis. And while Tolkien denied the influence, there is of course the shadow of the other saga about a corrupting ring drawing from a lot of the same sources, Richard Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. But where Wagner's spiritual core was a kind of proto-New Age paganism, the Roman Catholic Tolkien took as his spiritual wellspring the Hebrew and Palestinian religious influence of the Good Book, and its updating for England in the Advent lyrics, a fragmentary collection of Old English religious poems which were so influential on Middle-earth that they've been called the catalyst for Tolkien's mythology. He even drew on pterodactyl fossils for his zoology. And while it might seem like Tolkien was only drawing on these sources for inspiration, there was something weirder at play. Tolkien's followers were not scholars in Oxbridge libraries or nationalist unifiers or even linguistics-obsessed historical fiction authors. Instead, he mainstreamed the idea of world building, the invention of a setting totally removed from our material history. How many worlds in novels, films, and D&D games have been built in the shadow of Tolkien? But while his followers today create fictional cultures, Middle-earth is less distinct from our world than it might first seem. Asked about the one god of Middle-earth, Tolkien replied that he was the one, of course. The book is about the world that God created, the actual world of this planet. And there was an emerging audience ready to hear exactly that. The decades immediately after Tolkien's 1954 publication of The Lord of the Rings were a golden age of British pop cultural exports. Their music, in particular, was the explosion of a distinctly British take on American music, infusing it with a romantic sensibility that made rock the representative form of the 60s dream. An anti-establishment spirituality had passed from Rousseau and Goethe into the romantic poets of Britain, into Beethoven and Wagner in Germany, Emerson and Thoreau in America, filtering its way through modernism and jazz and the Beat generation until, at last, it hit the mainstream in the 60s. Suddenly, Romanticism was everywhere. British musicians were quoting Blake and Byron. British filmmakers were prophesying the coming of the Star Child. Living through this cultural upheaval, Tolkien clung to his traditionalist Christianity. While the Catholic Church declared in 1963 that Mass could be held in English, Tolkien not only continued to insist on the Latin Mass, but would speak loud Latin in the midst of English services. But the Flower Children were uninterested in dusty churches and national myths. The Rings trilogy, though written by a Catholic traditionalist and English patriot, were beloved for their environmentalist and anti-war message. The Shire became a model for hippie communes. The Beatles even looked into producing a Lord of the Rings film in 1968. John Lennon went to Stanley Kubrick's office shortly after the release of Kubrick's New Age science fiction film 2001 and tried to get him on board with a New Age fantasy to go with it. John Lennon was going to play Gollum, Paul was going to play Frodo, George Harrison was going to be Gandalf, and Ringo Starr was going to play Sam. And we actually have this information from a 2014 interview with Peter Jackson. Tolkien shot down this idea, but that didn't dampen hippie enthusiasm. So while we never got the Beatles' Rings musical, Gollum and Sauron do steal Robert Plant's girlfriend and Led Zeppelin's Ramble On. And some Tolkien fans went further, and took Tolkien at his word that Middle-earth was our own world. These hippies treated rings as a revealed religion. Maybe not a literal history, but a spiritually accurate retelling of the fall of humankind from a golden age, with Tolkien as a divinely inspired scribe. Early religious practices inspired by the Lord of the Rings began to spring up in the late 60s. Some hippies married each other in ceremonies based on books, and read passages during LSD trips in order to amplify the spiritual experience. They didn't take Middle-earth as Christian, but absorbed Tolkien's cosmology into the roots of 60s cosmic consciousness. So while Tolkien rejected the counterculture, the high flyers who treated the Lord of the Rings as their Book of Mormon were only a particularly intense branch of the countercultural tree that grew from Tolkien's rich mythological mulch. Despite Tolkien bemoaning Britain's lack of a mythical epic, it certainly wasn't a country lacking in identity. Tolkien had to go back to Hengist and Horsa leading the Jutes, Angles and Saxons to 5th century Britain, because for the 1500 years after that, England had its cultural identity. The Brothers Grimm were collecting folk tales for a nation which wasn't even unified until after their deaths, and Finland didn't gain independence until the First World War. Meanwhile, Tolkien was trying to invent a backstory for an island nation that had its own identity before half his sources were even written. Instead, his myth was caught up in the wave of strange, long-haired young people trying to change the world. It had an audience, but not the one Tolkien had envisioned. And it could have remained that way, its roots in national mythologizing forgotten, associated with potheads and hippies and rockers, if not for a small island nation shopping around for a national identity. The pink and white terraces in New Zealand were once considered the eighth wonder of the world. The naturally forming hot pools were the country's first major tourist destination. Europeans would travel for months to Lake Rotomahama, access to which was controlled by tūhorangi, who helped transport and accommodate tourists.
There were stories in our culture that the gods were not happy because of what we were doing, selling our souls for the dollar.
On the 10th of June, 1886, Mount Tarawera erupted, covering the terraces with ash and cratering to form a new lake. The terraces were buried and submerged, gone forever. New Zealand had become very reliant on the tourist economy which had sprung up around the terraces, and there was a scramble to fill the gap left by their destruction. Soon, Waitomo Caves and Rotorua became tourist hotspots, and postcards and pamphlets were delivered globally, advertising the scenic New Zealand landscapes. Tourism and colonialism historically share an overlap, especially in the 1800s when the two were essentially growing in tandem. As Lenin put it in one of the earliest video essays about late capitalism, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. When you run out of stuff to monetize in your own country, you gotta go overseas. And a large part of this was convincing people to go on a long, dangerous boat ride as far from Britain as you could get. The New Zealand Company, which was a private business founded in order to systematically colonise New Zealand, aggressively promoted the country overseas by means we would now normally recognise as tourist advertising, publishing romanticised images of the landscape in books, pamphlets and broadsheets. Although tourist advertising played up New Zealand's exoticness, the country remained very tied to its colonial identity, a Little Britain of the South.
The 25-year-old Prince of Wales began his tour in Auckland in April 1920. He found New Zealanders calm, law-abiding and industrious, and heard no trace of a local accent in their speech. In short, he thought New Zealanders very British.
A lot of visitors who came to New Zealand in the late 1800s were there not to tour the landscape, but to observe recent liberal social reforms. The most common takeaway they seemed to have was that New Zealand was very British. Andrew Siegfried, a French academic who visited in 1899, commented that New Zealanders worshipped England and endowed it with a halo of romance. Mark Twain, who also visited, commented that it was a junior England all the way to Christchurch. My own great-grandmother always called England the motherland, even though she'd never been there and was born in New Zealand. The teaching of history within New Zealand has historically favoured Britain. The 1877 Education Act, which produced the first national curriculum, specified that if history was to be taught, only English history was to be transmitted. New Zealand content was made permissible to teach in the early 1900s, however the curriculum remained Anglo-centric, treating loyalty to the British Empire as a virtue. A sense of separate New Zealand identity only began to form in earnest in the wake of World War I, after New Zealand and Australian soldiers attempted an invasion at Gallipoli.
New Zealand, which sent troops to the Great War in 1914, was no longer a territorial extension of Britain, a colony, but an independent nation sharing the British monarch.
As is often the case, fighting in a foreign war began to cement New Zealand's internal sense of identity, and was also the first fracture in the country's relationship with Britain, culminating in 1973 when Britain joined the Common Market, breaking the trade relationship between both countries. It's interesting that today, despite decades of building an identity separate from England, New Zealand is now so dominated by a quintessentially British book series. Of course, Rings is no normal trilogy. It's a modern epic, offering the heft of historicism to New Zealand without any of the uncomfortable baggage that comes with it. The pink and white terraces pale in comparison to the sort of tourism Lord of the Rings has generated. However, most of these tourists aren't here for New Zealand, but for Middle-earth, replete with its own inbuilt fictive history. New Zealand, or rather Aotearoa, is a land already steeped in history and culture. In fact, the history I've been giving here is only a tiny sliver of the country's much older story. Aotearoa, New Zealand was the last major landmass in the world to be settled by humans. There's no firm evidence for when the first Polynesians arrived in New Zealand. Depending on who you ask, how you weigh the evidence, whether it's material, oral, philological or spiritual, it could have been anywhere from the mid-thousands to as late as the 1300s. Were the legendary 7 waka, the ancestral canoes carrying the people who would become Māori, an organised fleet? Were they a disconnected series of voyages, or something in between? As with Tolkien's prehistoric Europe, we are here at the very edge of recorded history. Having arrived on the islands, Māori did not see themselves as a singular culture. They were unified by a language, te reo, literally the language, and by a network of family and tribal connections called whakapapa. You would be tied to various iwi by family connections and alliances, and on a smaller level to sub-tribes. Māori lineages are still traced back to key ancestors who led the voyages on those founding canoes. These genealogies were maintained through recitation and encoded into whakairo, Māori carving, and waiata, which served as historical records. Tohunga, or elders, in this case functioning as historians from different tribes, would get together each year and ensure everyone's records were the same. These complex, intertwined genealogies are some of the most accurate in the world. Many Māori today can trace their lineage back further than most non-aristocratic Europeans. Māori culture was distinct from the rest of Oceania in that no other Pacific culture had such a significant landmass. For every square kilometre of land in the Pacific, there are 500 square kilometres of ocean. The fact that New Zealand was such a substantial landmass gave forests and earth more central place in Māori culture, compared to the more ocean-based characteristics of the smaller islands. Mountains, for instance, hold a special place in Māori thought. Every prominent mountain is linked to several local tribal identities. But similar to pre-revolutionary Europe, pre-colonial Māori culture was unified primarily by its geographical connection. It wasn't until European settlement that Māori even had a name for themselves as a whole, and Māori just means normal, ordinary, everyday. Until Europeans arrived, there was nothing exotic to contrast their normalcy with. So, just as the Anglo-Saxon invasion led to English identity, so too a collective sense of Māoridom formed in opposition to British colonialism. Through a mixture of tourism and settler colonialism, the British started to trickle in after James Cook's expedition in 1769. In 1840, when the European population was a little over a quarter of the Māori one, the agents of the British Crown proposed a treaty. This was the fashion at the time, though in practice it was a legalistic justification for the British Crown's only slightly less brutal than usual treatment of Māori. But, eager to avoid the treatment some Māori leaders had witnessed of the Australians, who hadn't received a treaty, the hastily drawn up and mistranslated document was signed by over 500 Māori leaders from various iwi. So heterogeneous was the population that even 500 Māori leaders didn't represent the whole Māori population, and many actively refused to sign. Only 5 years after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, war broke out. Between 1845 and 1872, the colonial government fought a series of conflicts with local tribes to take control of the country, squashing the emergent Māori kingship movement and making clear, in classic colonial fashion, that the Crown was in charge. While the Māori resistance was fairly successful, and they invented early forms of both trench warfare and non-violent resistance, the Crown had a functionally bottomless pool of resources to draw on. To make room for an influx of settlers and sheep farmers, the New Zealand landscape was transformed. The forests, which had made Māori culture unique among Polynesians, once cloaking the land from shore to shore in greenery, were harvested for timber, or more often simply burnt to the ground. Land was usually confiscated by the Crown from defeated resistors. It was common to build a highway through the middle of villages. State Highway 1, for example, runs through the middle of what was once Rangirere Pa. Occasionally, iwi would enter partnerships with the Crown to ensure a mutual protection of land. Such was the case in 1887, when the local iwi Ngāti Tūwharetoa offered the New Zealand government joint responsibility for protecting 3 of the country's mountains, Mount Tongariro, Ruapehu and Ngārohoi. This landscape will probably be familiar to you. Ngārohoi starred as Mount Doom in the Lord of the Rings films, and the scenes of Frodo and Sam climbing the mountain were partly filmed on Ruapehu. All this tussocky land surrounding the mountains was Mordor. Tūwharetoa hadn't especially wanted this partnership, but feared having their land confiscated outright like other iwi. The government conveniently interpreted their offer of partnership as the generous gifting of these mountains to the Crown. They established a national park in the early 1900s, and over the following century they continually sidelined Ngāti Tūwharetoa's involvement in the park's management. During the same period, Acts of Parliament banned various parts of traditional culture. The Māori literacy rate, once significantly higher than the European one, collapsed, and Māori were turned away from hospitals, banks, and other colonial institutions. Cultural relations in the country began to shift after the World Wars, when New Zealand, struggling to find itself as a society independent from the British Crown, started to reckon with its history. As part of the same international counterculture that led to the civil rights movement in America and anti-colonial struggles the world over, an era began today known as the Māori Renaissance. In 1962, the Tohunga Suppression Act, which had mandated the abandonment of traditional Māori culture, was repealed. Over the 70s and 80s, more legal changes and social movements started to improve Māori rights. Ngā Tamatoa formed as a local equivalent to the Black Panther Party. Witi Ihemaira became the first Māori writer to publish a novel and a book of short stories. Māori language radio stations were started all around the country. Then, in 1975, a permanent commission called the Waitangi Tribunal was established to investigate violations of the Treaty of Waitangi. A report on one such violation was released in 2013 on the Tongariro National Park, recently featured in the Lord of the Rings films. The report found that the Crown had not always honoured its obligations to protect the mountains. Commercial development had caused physical and cultural degradation to the environment. One issue was over-tourism. The Tongariro Crossing, an 8-hour alpine hike, had become immensely popular as a Lord of the Rings pilgrimage. On a busy day, 3,500 people might cross the fairly unregulated mountain walk. Rubbish and sometimes even human waste littered the track. The path was never built to accommodate so many people, and the entire situation was unsustainable, both for the environment and for the strained relations between Tūwharetoa and the government. The case is still open, and there's no clear resolution in sight. There are obviously many wider legalities and problems with over-touristing in general. But the angle that I think is relevant to our story is what these landscapes mean to those who visit. The memory of The Lord of the Rings turns these mountains into mythic portals, a way of stepping momentarily into a fictional world. But to Māori, especially those with Tūwharetoa whakapapa, these mountains hold an immediate spiritual significance. Tongariro is literally an ancestor to all those whose lineages come from the surrounding countryside. By contrast, look at this painting by William Hodges, an artist who visited New Zealand on one of the first European voyages. This is a classic example of the sublime, an aesthetic sweeping Europe at the time. The sublime was a sense of awe in the face of the terrifying drama of the natural world, something which Hodges found in the unfamiliar New Zealand landscape. Where Tūwharetoa saw ancestry and history, Hodges saw the mysteries of nature, not categories that fit easily together, but both profound enough to serve as a culture's worldview. Today, most visitors come to see Jackson's Mordor. The landscape serves for each group as a cradle of meaning, and the different cultural meanings inevitably shape how we treat those landscapes, whether we protect them, explore them, or just tramp through them. In a sense, this is the story of modern New Zealand, two cultures coexisting in an increasingly globalised nation, who understand the land on which they live in very different ways. A country, a landscape, a landmass, is a canvas on which we project our dreams. Like Finland, or Germany, or the New World that 60s radicals were trying to build, New Zealand and Aotearoa had to be pieced together out of fragmented British and Māori identities and histories. The late 20th century saw two very different cultures, both of whom had sailed as far from what they knew as anyone ever had, try to share a dream that would bring them together, trying to tell a story of a bicultural nation. In his 1889 essay, The Decay of Lying, Oscar Wilde drops one of his most famous aphorisms: "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life." By way of example, he mentions paintings of London fog in the then new style of Impressionism. At present, people see fogs not because there are fogs, but because poets and painters have taught them the mysterious loveliness of such effects. There may have been fogs for centuries in London. I dare say there were, but no one saw them, and so we do not know anything about them. They did not exist till art had invented them. For Wilde, art shapes how we understand the world. Things are because we see them, and what we see and how we see it depends on the arts that have influenced us. In 1970, New Zealand's National Film Unit released a 3-screen pageant called This Is New Zealand. Originally screened in Japan, this promo film presented giant vistas and landscapes, sweeping mountain shots, and local culture. The film was made with an international audience in mind, but strangely, it became much more popular domestically, eventually being screened 10 times a day, 6 days a week throughout the country. Like Turner painting the London fog, the film trained its audience how to see their own country. In a Wildean sense, New Zealand as we imagine it, the mountains, the rivers, the wild landscapes, didn't exist to most city-dwelling people until they'd seen it on screen. The runaway success of This Is New Zealand was a turning point in the country's self-identification. A sense of what New Zealand is was coming not from wars, but from cinema. 30 years later, Lord of the Rings, with its beautiful scenics and sweeping mountain shots, would do the same thing.
We've prepared this film especially for you, our Australian neighbours, to show you that there's now a livelier approach to tourism in New Zealand.
New Zealand's National Film Unit, the one which released This Is New Zealand, trained a generation of directors who put the country on screen over the next decades. These were film students who'd cut their teeth on tourist documentaries, promoting New Zealand at home and abroad. The films they started to make in the late 70s and early 80s, Smash Palace, Vigil, The Scarecrow, found something sinister in the landscape. Within the beauty was a lurking horror, which Sam Neill, who made a foundational documentary on the topic, termed the cinema of unease. These films were also being produced in the wake of the Māori Renaissance. For the first time since England's successful consolidation of power, there was an active conversation about the way the colonial governments had treated the indigenous population. This is not to say that the revision of our national image went smoothly. While directors were pushing at these discomforts, politics was backsliding. Meratamita's documentary Patu followed the 1981 Springbok tour, where the South African rugby team, a country then under apartheid, toured New Zealand. Widespread protests boiled over into intense scenes of police brutality. Mita's film remains probably the most important documentary in New Zealand film history. Never before had the true nature of government and police power been so apparent on screen. That same year, Mita acted and served as a cultural advisor for her husband Jeff Murphy's Utu. This is how small the local scene was. Utu took the uneasy landscapes from the first wave of rebellious films and used them to investigate our colonial era. These two films dragged New Zealand history kicking and screaming back into our landscapes and onto our screens. By the 90s, films like Jane Campion's The Piano and Lee Tamahori's Once Were Warriors had brought our cinema to greater acclaim and wider audiences than ever before. And with his gothic teen lesbian murder mystery Heavenly Creatures, Peter Jackson himself contributed to the booming business of New Zealand's unease. The film opens with idyllic archival footage of 1950s Christchurch, a scenic backdrop to a famously brutal crime. Gardens are a continual motif of Heavenly Creatures, the well-tended English parks and front lawns of 50s Christchurch masking something sinister and repressed. The filmmakers experimented with then cutting-edge technology to create fantastical dreamscapes.
Computer effects is something that I never thought I'd be interested in until recently. It's becoming very clear now that this is what the future of film is going to be.
A year later, Jackson and Botas would make Forgotten Silver, a tongue-in-cheek alternate history in which New Zealand cinema was rewritten not as a slow, conflicted movement towards a complex sense of national identity, but as a saga of one heroic individual struggling to produce epic cinema. The fact that so many people fell for the joke suggests that the filmmakers had tapped into an appetite of their audience. The public were ready to celebrate a maverick individualist, an explorer and innovator. When Jackson set out a year later to make his Lord of the Rings, the representative New Zealand cinematic landscapes, the way we had taught ourselves and the world to look at Aotearoa New Zealand, with the North Island depicted in Campion's masterpiece and South Auckland depicted in Tamahori's, it would not remain that way for long. It's maybe odd to bring this up an hour into a video, but it should be said that the Lord of the Rings films are very good, and even the fact that they were made at all is kind of astonishing. Jackson had never made a film anywhere near this scale before, let alone 3 in a row, filmed all at once. His early horror and splatter movies like Brain Dead and Bad Taste had showcased not only his creativity and his sense of humour, but an incredible attention to detail, supercharged on rings. To give only the most famous example, pre-production saw the creation of over 19,000 hand-stitched costumes, each detailed uniquely, 48,000 pieces of armour, 10,000 arrows, 500 bows, 1,800 pairs of hobbit feet. But this level of detail doesn't exactly make things easy. Many people think that the Hobbit films' messy pre-production is the reason that they aren't as good as the earlier trilogy. But Rings was hardly a well-oiled machine. Plenty of decisions were made last minute or on the fly. Aragorn's original actor, Stuart Townsend, was fired after production had begun, and Viggo Mortensen had only 1 day of sword training before filming his first scene fighting the Black Riders. Animals were added in post, scenes moved around between movies. Fran Walsh described the overall mood as furiously laying the tracks in front of the train as it's rumbling up behind you. Given all this, it kind of beggars belief that the films are as excellent as they are. Jackson had an incredible amount of pressure on him, and he not only delivered, he reinvented what fantasy cinema could be. A lot of the pleasure of fantasy films before Jackson, much like his own early horror films, is the appreciation of puppetry and painted backdrops. Like a Wes Anderson movie, the artificiality is part of the charm. With Rings, Jackson did for fantasy what George Lucas had done for science fiction. He simulated a real world on the screen, a screen that, as it happened, you could step into and walk around in. It was only an Air New Zealand ticket away.
Welcome aboard this Air Middle-earth flight.
I loved Peter Jackson. In high school, I obsessed over his biography, trying to figure out how he did it, going from back garden films in Pukurua Bay to helming arguably the most successful fantasy franchise ever made. His rise seemed almost inexplicable to me. He didn't step so much as lunge, always making films a level beyond what he'd be presumed capable of. At only 15, he made a 20-minute stop-motion film inspired by Ray Harryhausen. Jackson recognised that there weren't really conventional paths for becoming a filmmaker in New Zealand, and so he just became a filmmaker. If there was no path, then there were no gatekeepers. The material resourcefulness with which The Lord of the Rings were made may not have been part of the story they told, but it was at the heart of their making. But that story would be the ring Jackson would disappear behind for the rest of his career, and with him the New Zealand film industry's relationship to, well, New Zealand. In 1999, TVNZ sold the National Film Unit Studios to our old friend Peter Jackson. He refurbished the studio into Park Road Post, and in Wellington's sleepy Miramar suburbs, established the empire which has dominated the New Zealand film industry ever since. The overwhelming success of Rings and its spin-offs has, in a sense, killed the dream which gave Jackson his name. New Zealand isn't punching above its weight. It boasts world-class film facilities and helms a lot of major Hollywood blockbusters. The 10 highest-grossing movies shot in New Zealand have all been international blockbusters, the Lord of the Rings trilogy and 7 more films made in part at Park Road. Aotearoa landscapes sometimes feature in these films, but increasingly only in glimpses, usually buried under layers of CGI, in Ghost in the Shell, the Minecraft movie, Mission Impossible Fallout, The Last Samurai. These landscapes aren't real places so much as laptop backgrounds, generic stand-ins for other locations. Watching behind-the-scenes footage for Jackson's Heavenly Creatures, the early CGI feels of a part with that number 8 wire creativity. But by the time we got to Rings of Power, the whole thing was wire. A major criticism of the Amazon series was that it didn't feel like Lord of the Rings, and I think this is just because so much of it was filmed on sets and sound stages, supplemented with CGI. The original trilogy's emphasis on on-location filming, practical effects, and handmade costumes was replaced by pixel pushes burying actors in mocap suits under layers of visual effects, and plopping them down in landscapes that had a New Zealandish tint to them, third or fourth hand interpretations of Jackson's transformation of the New Zealand landscape into fantasy fodder. It's not that we haven't had our uneasy landscape cinema since then, some of it very good. It's that, with the exception of Taika Waititi's parodies of this era's tropes, Lord of the Rings has dominated our self-image. Our imaginative landscape, both for us and the rest of the world, had started to look like this. And now it looks like this.
Middle Zealand.
Jackson may not have intended to change how we look at ourselves, or to transform Middle-earth from countercultural hieroglyph to Hollywood franchise fodder. As with any work of art, the life it's taken on after release has been, at least somewhat, out of his hands. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings films are amazing and beloved in their own right. But 25 years on from the release of the first film, the fact that Lord of the Rings remains so totalizingly dominant, from tourism to literal law changes, suggests that this isn't just fond nostalgia for a popular film trilogy, but a kind of national myth-making. Only now it's not philologists seeking local poetry in far-flung reaches of a country. It's the national dream of a different country, imposed on a landscape rich in its own poorly taught history. New Zealand history wasn't even mandatory to teach in schools until 2022. For half a century, we've been coming to terms with New Zealand's history through cinema, learning how to understand the landscape in which we lived. Now, that same cinema has fed us a mythic history which we've all too readily adopted. In saying all of this, I'm very aware that about half a percentage point of my audience are actually from New Zealand. Most of you watching probably aren't that invested in our mixed feelings about a quarter-century-old film trilogy, but what I've been talking about applies to wherever you are in the world. Art shapes our experience of the places we live in. Turns out most of you watching are American, so take the example of the Western. It's a history dreamed up largely by Hollywood and pulp fiction writers, a dream of a national history that never really took place. Real cowboys were usually poor young men ranching for cash, more likely to wear bowlers than 10-gallon hats, and the period only lasted for 2 or 3 decades. But since the Western has a grounding in real events, however tenuous, when the genre reinvents itself, it's an engagement with the dream of history, from Leone's spaghetti westerns to the gritty revisionist westerns in the 90s. In New Zealand, Jeff Murphy's Utu, a classic of the cinema of Unease, marketed itself as a puha western. But in place of the uneasy struggle with our history, Lord of the Rings gives us the weight of history without local memory, an aura of historicism that cinema imposes on the landscape without reference to real events. All the discomforts of the landscape, the real history of the topography people now call Middle-earth, are smoothed into the vistas of Jackson's Fantasia. This is no longer Ngārahoe, the wife of Mount Tongariro, site of battles and of broken treaties, not to mention local iwi's struggle to get their existing sovereignty observed. It's Mount Doom. Not this, but this. Teaching people their history, as Tolkien understood, is not the same as giving people a dream. You can't teach people to dream in school. As Wilde argued, you need art for that. So this is Jackson's ultimate achievement. The testament to his filmmaking, but also his dubious legacy for Aotearoa and New Zealand. When we gaze upon our landscapes now, we don't see the uneasy history of the 1990s, but a mythology custom-made to unify a people we used to be. During the writing of this video, Costa, co-director of Forgotten Silver, passed away. He was an incredible documentarian, as well as being a teacher and an invaluable member of New Zealand's film scene for many, many years. Forgotten Silver is often credited to Peter Jackson, but it was Botis's idea originally, and I think it really exemplifies his talents and skills as a filmmaker. So in his memory, I would encourage anyone who's made it this far to watch Forgotten Silver. It's funny and full of heart, and it has so many jokes which I promise I didn't spoil in this video. I do recommend watching it with a friend who doesn't know it's a mockumentary and see how long it takes them to catch on.